Hi, everyone.
Hi, welcome. I am so excited to be here because I always like to say I kind of got my education from the Eames. I started out at Dwell magazine and then worked for Herman Miller for a while. And I think when I think about talking about design or sort of the things that matter to me, my sort of core principles, I always go back to these tenets from Charles and Ray. They stay with me. And so Lisa and I are going to nerd out really hard, and we hope that you enjoy it. But Lisa is the youngest of 5 grandchildren,
Yep.
Charles and Ray. And so she has a very unique perspective also on their design legacy. You were a sculptor, as Nico mentioned earlier, but also what I think is really fascinating and exciting is that you really have this perspective of how their design principles just infused everything they did.
Yeah.
So I want you to tell a little bit about being a granddaughter to Charles and Ray and how this started for you.
It's really wonderful to be a granddaughter of Ray and Charles Eames, and what we're doing at the Eames Institute of Infinite Curiosity is to unpack the way they worked, the way they imbued their designs and their lives with curiosity and discovery to face challenges at any scale. And what I found is I look at things as a granddaughter, but I also look at things as a curator, and I keep learning more and more. This is me and Charles at the Eames house, and I'm often asked, what's your earliest memory of spending time with your grandparents? And it's going out to dinner with them. At the Eames office was in Venice, California, very close to the beach, and we went to have dinner. We're coming back from dinner. Now imagine I'm 8 years old. It was borscht. I love borscht now, I make borscht, but it was borscht. So Charles turns to me as we're walking back, and he says, what did you think of dinner? And I quite frankly said, I didn't like it. Do you know what he said to me without missing a beat? How would you have done things differently? He said, do you know what you don't like? Do you know what's in borscht? I had no idea. He said, there's potatoes, there's butter, you could have made mashed potatoes, there's beets. So we had a whole conversation for a couple of blocks thinking of all the things we could make with beets and the borscht and the ingredients. We walk a little bit further, and then he turns to me and he says, why was it borscht tonight? Was it somebody's favorite dinner? Is it something they read about in a magazine? So we had a whole conversation about that. Now, I felt very empowered, I felt heard, and I felt very encouraged, and it made me really look at things differently, and a story that I've always loved. Now, I shared that story for those of you who may have seen an Eames exhibit at the Oakland Museum a few years ago with the docents. And the next time I went to the exhibit, one of the docents came running over to me. She said, Lisa, your borscht story worked. I said, fantastic, how? She said, the next time my grandchildren complained about the salads, I said, how would you do it differently? And it turned out it was the mushrooms. And she's like, I don't care that it's mushrooms they're eating or not eating. So what I love is these lessons that we all have from Ray and Charles continue on.
So tell us a little bit about, the archive and the institute. I think one thing that is really magical about this work, I think we all know the furniture, we all know their collection, we probably have them in our homes, but what you really are trying to do is show a little bit of the process.
Right.
It's not the artifact, it's how you got there.
Right.
And so tell us a little bit about the archive and how you're presenting this work.
So after Ray and Charles passed away, I was 12 when Charles passed away in 1978, and Ray passed away 10 years to the day in 1988. What ended up happening is my mother inherited this amazing archival material from their office. Ray had asked for the office to be closed and the building sold because there had been earthquakes in the early 80s, and therefore to try to take care of the Eames house. And so what you're seeing here is where my mother brought the archival material up to the ranch in Petaluma, where we could archive the pieces and start to share them in different ways and start loaning them to collections. And here's the interior of the space. And what was great is most people do enter the world of Ray and Charles through furniture, but it was a chance to share about films, photography, graphics, all these ways that they used to communicate their ideas.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find really fascinating, we were talking about this the other day too, is sort of these iconic pieces of furniture. I think the process of making them, and I love the story particularly about the molded plywood, where they're really thinking about not just the material, but also how are you going to make the thing? How are you going to have the materials sort of, no pun intended, but like bend to your will? And you have a great story about, how they were making the tools to make the objects.
Exactly.
And that was part of the process.
Exactly. So what you're seeing here now is our new Richmond space where I'm giving public tours and private tours of the collection. And one of the questions we're most often asked is, what is the first project they worked on together? And it's the molded plywood story, which most people think ends with the chairs. But as you can see on the table here, it's far more than that. The reason it's such an important experience that Ray and Charles had is Ray came from painting and Charles came from architecture, and this was their first project together. It was how to make a molded plywood chair. The first thing they realized as they start to try to do this in LA is how something is made influences design. So they quickly realized they had to make the prototypes and the machines that made the prototypes. Then they would make the first 5,000, making sure everything's worked out before shipping it to Herman Miller, who could scale it up to 100,000. Another valuable lesson they learned on this is they realized they had entered it with preconceived notions. They thought the wood was going to move differently than this. And what they did is they let the design come from the learning, the honest use of the materials. So this is why it's very important to us, the very important key point that they learned, and they applied this to all their design projects.
I mean, it really, to me, it's sort of that understanding of, how you use the tools, putting the effort into making your tools. I think we've talked a lot about AI in the last couple of days, and I think of this as another tool that we're trying to learn how to use and to bend to our will in certain ways, and it resists us in certain ways, and we have to work with it.
Right.
We have to push it to understand it further. And I think these lessons really apply across into the digital realm, into digital design.
Absolutely. So this is the first tool they built, the Kazam machine. They thought it was magic. You put a flat piece of veneer in and it came out curved. This was in the second bedroom of their apartment in Los Angeles. And here, I think what's important is because they understood how wood did or did not work, they could take the idea of making the chair but then apply it to making a leg splint in 1942 during the World War II. They had heard from a colleague of theirs that soldiers carried off the field. A vibration in the splint, if it was metal, would make the wound far worse by the time you got to the ambulance. So understanding wood, they created this leg splint, and over 100,000 were made by 1943. And what's even more important to Ray and Charles, it was a way to help the war effort without hurting anyone.
I think when we look at that sort of breadth of work and application of materials, I mean, just thinking about, the molded plywood chair, how many iterations they had of that, and then also thinking about, the war effort, using the material to apply it to another cause, it really shows something about how they practiced design and their sort of broad interests. And so this is a really wonderful slide, and I'm going to have Llisa unpack it for us, because this is sort of how they looked at their process and how they decided what they wanted to focus on.
Yes, so this was a diagram that Ray and Charles made. In the collection, we have it both in Ray's handwriting and Charles's. This happens to be Charles's because it's a graphic they had at their office. So this is how they explained their design process to their client. There was always the first circle, which was what Ray and Charles in the office wanted to accomplish. The second circle was their client, but there was always a third circle. So that was society as a whole. And you had to focus on the part that overlapped all three. So the leg splint we mentioned would go in there. The National Aquarium project they did, where they wanted people to care about something you couldn't see, making the invisible visible, that goes in there. Mathematica, an exhibit that they designed with IBM, goes in there. That was success, was finding that. Now the trick is, under that note, these areas are not static. Each grows and develops on each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing too, is like, we look at these sort of objects, and they do have a life, and they have a story, and they have the context around it, and they were always so good at revisiting an idea.
Right.
And also, but the thing that we want to talk about here is also just not just revisiting the idea, but constantly questioning it, and constantly questioning how the user is going to be interacting with these objects. And so I think the Eames Aluminum Group is a great
It's a,
Great segue here.
it's a great example. I mean, Eames Aluminum Group is interesting just because they were trying to make a piece of furniture that could be indoors or outdoors. What I love about these are some of my favorite prototypes in the collection is you can see where they've sliced and modified the ends. Each one is different. Now, in the end, the person who carved this carved 8 of these. And in the end, Ray and Charles picked the first one he made. And he's like, hey, I have, 6 or 7 others here. And you know what they said? And he completely agreed. They said you had to make those other 6 to know the first one was right.
Always be iterating, right?
Always iterating,
Right.
honing. There's another great line that Ray and Charles were often asked, did you design that chair in a flash? And they would say, yes, a 30-year flash. That was part of the reason why they liked working with Herman Miller and Vitra, is that you could always go back and revisit and hone those ideas and keep prototyping. There was always improvements that could be made.
Yeah, I mean, and also with the aluminum group, it's just the applications, the materials, the indoor, outdoor kind
Right.
of capacity. They just were always looking at these ways to modify and change.
And this might happen to you all too. They had wanted to make indoor-outdoor furniture before. It wasn't until 2 materials came around, which was aluminum and then saran, which was a fabric that was used on cars. They also used it on the speaker that they designed as the face of the speaker. So part of what we want to do in the collection is we're tagging things so you can look at it not just chronologically, but by materials that they're exploring, because those were the cutting-edge materials at the time.
Right.
Now here's a tour that I'm giving, and what's important is not just sharing the object, but also sharing the stories, the questions that Ray and Charles were asking as they were designing the object. I'm advancing to the next one. So this is a view into the collection center. The reason I have the chaise in the foreground here is that's an example where we show people they coated the bases so the cold wouldn't transfer to your back. It's all part of what was called the guest-host relationship. Ray and Charles considered that everything they did was to anticipate the needs of their client before they thought of it. And what I loved is they knew I wanted to be a sculptor. So they said, you need to be able to use every tool as well, if not better than the person you hire, or you won't know they're doing a good job. That was great advice. Also in this collection, we have the example of the airport tandem seating. Now, what I have found is that Ray and Charles talked to a lot of maintenance teams in their
Love
years.
that.
So when they were asked to design airport seating, the first question they said, what's wrong with the existing airport seating? And when they talked to maintenance teams across the country, what they found, it was the replacement parts. But they asked again, what does that mean? And the maintenance teams would explain, the back and the seat were heavily upholstered, 2 different shapes, took up a lot of storage room, and took 1 or 2 people to pop out the old and put in the new. So what I love with my grandparents' work, it's more about mending systems, if they could, as opposed to replacing them. And that's what we love to explore here. Now, yes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that idea of just where something is going, again, to talk about context, I think this image where we're kind of getting a glimpse into their studio. And I think this sort of interest in how people will use things, what materials we're going to have, you really see this starting to come to life in their studio culture.
Absolutely. And when you visited the office, as you can see, they're working on the Eames Aluminum Group furniture. They're also, in the foreground there is a multi-screen presentation that they're going to do in Moscow. In the background is a stage set for photographing the pieces. It was a very flexible space where they were always trying out different ideas. And then what I love is today we have many of these artifacts that you see here. And what I found with the collection was there's one way to share it, like with each object and one picture of the object, but what we can do, which is exciting, is do this art-directed shoots with our creative team, where we are juxtaposing and also able to show the pieces that went into the making of the object and the artifact.
Yeah, I think really when you think about the sort of process and understanding what they were looking at and why they were doing what they were doing, you get a much larger window into why the pieces are so successful. I think we see them, we know they're beautiful, we know they're comfortable, but you realize that there was a lot of work to get there. Yes. And there's a lot of influence and magic that kind of comes into that. And I think we need to remember that, I think, as designers and practicing is like, what is the thing that is actually captivating you? What interests you
Right.
about it?
What I love is they always talked about addressing the need. There's only two ways a project came to them. It was a need that they thought had to happen, or that somebody came to them with a need. And one of my favorite stories is Budweiser came to them and said, would you redesign our label for our bottle? They looked at it for a few months and they said, you know what, it's doing everything it's supposed to be doing, and gave the project back. So in each case, there was a need to address, which I love, but they also followed their curiosity and just leaned into that learning. And some things didn't match the 5,000 production. And they actually stayed at the office. We also have prototypes that did not go into production. We have airport seating for a family of 4. It's a beautiful shell. And maybe it could be today, but at the time it just wasn't. So what's in this particular picture is also just in that foreground is how Ray and Charles stored their toys. So one toy could be used on a house of cards, or as here, a top is in a short film. And here's a house of cards here. And so toys are used in multiple ways. And again, Ray and Charles really love toys. You know why? Because toys are preludes to serious ideas. And also, there are certain toys that are across all cultures. 2 of them are kites and tops. And so what they loved seeing was the different materials, the different ways of making it. But the big thing is, it wasn't designed by one person. It's designed over generations. So that I always love. So we have 220 boxes of the toys, and we're now rehousing the objects, but we're also keeping the original boxes of how they stored them. This particular toy came about. So Alcoa, this is another thing that I really love thinking about, and I wonder how this happens today. But Alcoa reached out to the community of designers and architects to say, hey, we have this new material called aluminum. What can you do with it? Now, what did Ray and Charles do? You can see they're working on this beautiful machine. It twirls, it spins, it's fantastic, but it doesn't do anything. It's a solar do-nothing machine. And what you're really being taught about is, do you see the solar panel? That's what they're trying to share with you, is that there's alternatives to fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And that's what I love.
I was just going to say, I think this is one of my favorite projects too, and I think it kind of really speaks to this idea of the prelude to serious ideas. This sort of fascination, this just beauty for beauty's sake, just watching a thing spin, and the interactivity and harnessing the power of the material to do something that is just purely delightful, but presents an interesting technical innovation that has a meaning behind it, but celebrates the meaning through whimsy and magic. And I think they do this in a lot of ways too.
Oh, absolutely. For this next project, I don't know if you knew that they were designing an aquarium proposal for Washington, D.C. Their concern at this point, this is the 1960s, is how do you get people to want to conserve the oceans? And so that means, how do you get people to see something they can't see, which is underwater, making the invisible visible? So being my grandparents the way they operate, they had 20 saltwater tanks at the office. And they said, we like watching how creatures move through the water. Maybe somebody else will too. They said, though, that the real learning came from taking care of the creatures in the tanks, because any change in salinity or temperature would put the creatures in shock. So that made them think more sustainably of the production of their furniture. They also knew with politics it might not happen. So they created this booklet, which really became a cornerstone of what becomes the Monterey Bay Aquarium and the Baltimore Aquarium. This exhibit is the first exhibit they did for IBM, Mathematica, A World of Numbers and Beyond. Now, IBM had been asked to make a large donation to a new science and industry museum in LA. They said, we'd rather give you an exhibit by Ray and Charles Eames. Ray and Charles and Eames had never done this before. So they said, yes, we'll do this. And they visited several natural history museums across the United States. They wanted to see what the most popular exhibit was at that time. At that time, it was a vitrine with a hot heat lamp and a little baby chick trying to hatch out of an egg. Everyone was captivated looking at this. So Ray and Charles said to themselves, whatever we design has to be more entertaining than a baby chick hatching out of an egg. They also realized as they walked through the exhibits that you can't show everything on a subject. all you can do is show 6, 8, 10, 12 things that get somebody excited enough to learn more. And that's what we're doing at the Eames Institute. We're just showing you there's a breadth of work and what they call more found learning, less teaching. Follow your curiosity. What are you interested in? And go with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think also the one thing that we talked about a lot too, just with the exhibitions as well, is just sort of like how do you actually kind of convey information, the information that you need, but not overwhelm. And then I love the anecdote about how do you the line. You have to tell me the line about keeping a.
It's a great line, yes. The line is you have to excite the 10-year-old but not embarrass the professional on the subject.
Yeah.
Therefore, when you do an exhibit, you can't fake it. You can only show what you understand. I do like that line. This particular is a multi-screen presentation they did for Moscow. It's called Glimpses of the USA. And for this particular case, they knew your eye can take in more than your ear. So that's why it's 7 screens. And what you saw in the foreground before, they tried 9 screens, they tried 3 screens, 7 was the optimum. But they also knew there wasn't going to be enough time to take all the pictures. So they went to Lucid Time magazine and said, may we borrow some? He said, yes, but you'll owe me a favor. And that ends up designing the 1961 new executive suites at the Time Life building.
I will say also just anecdotally, this was on our mood board for the opening keynote film that we worked on. So again, like I said, I put them all in my pocket, carry them with me. I go back to it a lot.
Good. And then some of you might be familiar with Powers of 10, which is an absolute favorite. So that's what I saw in 1978. That was what Charles was filming. So when I went down to visit LA, they were very generous. They never talked down to us. They just shared whatever they were learning. And so I thought everyone's grandparents made movies like Powers of 10 or 3-screen slideshows. And they also kept meticulous notes for each of us grandchildren. We have wonderful stories where they knew everything they had shared with us and knew what was new for us each time we visited. But this was for Powers of 10, which I think was very important. It was an idea that actually Eliel Saarinen, Arrow's father, talked to Charles about back at Cranbrook, which was you always look at something and the next larger scale, and then back in. This was 40 jumps of connecting from the smallest to the largest thing in the universe. I don't know if you know, there was an earlier version in '68, which is in black and white, which comes out of Florida. But then when they realized to have it be able to come out at 10 to the plus 21 with the Milky Way that you see in the upper left, you had to come out of Chicago. So that's why it switches over to Chicago. And they actually eliminated the clock because the scientists could not prove at that time what the clocks would do at the speed of light. So again, you only share what you understand. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really, this is one of my favorite photos. We had a bunch of photos. It was very hard photo edit for this presentation, I will let you know. But I think here you see this sort of, I think Billy embodies their spirit.
Yes.
Always crafting, always thinking about the sort of context, and this is just simply, I mean, this is a floral arrangement. Right. What are they doing here?
Well, it might be a study because Herman Miller asked them to design the stock certificate. This is back in the 60s, and I love this idea. Ray asked for a bouquet of flowers at the location in Zeeland, Michigan to be picked and shipped on dry ice to Los Angeles.
Yes.
Then she made the bouquet, Charles took the picture, and it was on the stock certificate for many decades. But the whole point of it was, it's floral GPS. Those flowers were unique to where the headquarters was. You couldn't see the combination anywhere else in the world. And so I just loved that thoughtfulness, the back to the guest-host relationship, and just a great way to use that for that.
Yeah, I think when we think about just their sort of legacy and that sort of thoughtfulness and intention, I think, the other thing I will just say about flowers and about Ray specifically and her relationship with flowers is one of the things that we were talking about a lot is that they say to take your pleasure seriously.
Oh, absolutely. And the example they always like to give is the tightrope walker in the circus takes their pleasure very seriously. But they did, and they really, I think what was so special is they were just always enthusiastic. They didn't believe in the gifted few. They believed you got good at what you like to do, so go find it. That's when they got impatient, was when someone talked about an idea but didn't execute it. The person said, I might fail. Well, they said, well, then that's one less misconception. Yeah. with this last slide, I just love that they were always so playful. Take your pleasure seriously. But also I've loved, in my years of being a curator, being with this collection for over 20 years, is there was a former staff who came and visited, and she told the story of it was her last day at work. And she said, I was wondering what their parting words were going to be to me. And Charles comes up to her desk, and he says, whatever you do, just keep up the quality. So I ask all of you, please just keep up the quality.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you, Llisa.
Thank you.